They said I was insolent. That word, cold, sharp, and humiliating, still rings in my head. It wasn't just an insult. It was their justification, the final label they slapped on me before escorting me out of the glass doors I had once walked through with pride. That morning had started like any other. Coffee, unread emails, the usual hum of ambition echoing through the marble halls of Bellington Capital. I'd worked there for 7 years. 7 years of 70-hour weeks, missed birthdays, and silent sacrifices. I was the youngest director in the firm's history, overseeing risk and compliance, a job that required both backbone and silence. And I had both, until the day I refused to stay silent anymore. The CEO, Marcus Lane, loved control more than profit. His temper was legendary, his charm rehearsed, his lies polished like glass trophies. But when I discovered discrepancies buried in the quarterly filings, numbers that didn't add up, assets inflated to mislead investors, I made the mistake of confronting him directly. I didn't sugarcoat my words. I asked questions. I demanded answers. And that's when everything changed. Within a week, whispers began circulating. Meetings I should have been in suddenly happened without me. My reports were reviewed and misfiled. HR called me in for a behavioral evaluation, as if integrity was now a symptom. Then came the summons, an emergency board meeting on a Friday afternoon. I walked in confident, expecting professionalism. What I faced instead was a performance. Marcus leaned back in his chair, flanked by HR and legal, pretending disappointment like a father scolding a child. "Your tone has become increasingly disrespectful," he said smoothly. "This firm values cooperation. Unfortunately, your behavior has crossed into insubordination." I stared at him, stunned. "You're firing me for doing my job?" He smiled, that infuriating corporate smile that hides knives. "We're terminating you for insolence, Ms. Carter, effective immediately." The words hit harder than I expected. Around that table sat people I'd mentored, negotiated for, protected. Not one of them looked at me. My throat tightened, but I forced my voice steady. "You'll regret this," I said quietly. Marcus leaned forward. "Careful, Amelia. Don't make this harder on yourself." I picked up my folder, straightened my jacket, and walked out. I didn't look back, but deep inside, a storm had already begun to form. When I got home, I sat in silence for hours, replaying every detail. The humiliation, the false accusations, the smirk on Marcus's face. I knew how corporate power worked. They thought they'd stripped me of mine. They thought the NDA, the exit clause, the legal jargon would keep me quiet. But they'd forgotten something. I had drafted my own contract 3 years ago when they promoted me to director. I'd negotiated every word of it myself, because I never trusted Marcus. And somewhere, buried in the fine print that their overconfident legal team had approved, was a clause that could turn this entire firm upside down. They thought I was powerless. But that clause, that one sentence they overlooked, was about to become their undoing. And soon, the same board that had called me insolent would be begging me for mercy. When I first joined Bellington Capital, I was 26, and naive enough to believe that merit mattered more than manipulation. The firm was a fortress of ambition, glass walls, silent hierarchies, and a culture that rewarded appearances over ethics. Everyone smiled, but no one meant it. I started in compliance, a department most people ignored until things went wrong. My days were filled with spreadsheets, legal codes, and corporate policies that no one actually read, but I was different. I read everything, every word, every clause, every footnote, because I knew the real power in business wasn't in the boardroom. It was buried in the paperwork no one bothered to understand. That obsession with detail made me useful, and soon, indispensable. Within 3 years, I'd been promoted twice, my salary doubled, and my signature began appearing on internal approvals that mattered. But the higher I climbed, the more I saw what was rotting beneath. Marcus Lane, the CEO, ran the firm like a monarch. He surrounded himself with people who praised him, and he despised anyone who questioned his methods. Deals were inflated, numbers were adjusted, and bonuses were tied to illusions rather than results. I had suspicions, but no proof, until the day I found it. It was late, almost midnight. The office was empty except for the cleaning crew and the soft hum of servers. I'd stayed behind to reconcile client ledgers before a quarterly audit. That's when I noticed the discrepancy, an offshore account linked to an inactive fund, showing movement that shouldn't exist. Small transfers, hidden under expense reallocations. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone was moving investor money to cover personal losses. I reported it quietly to Marcus the next morning, thinking he'd want to fix it before it spiraled. Instead, he brushed it off. Don't overcomplicate things, Amelia. These books are balanced where they need to be. That's when I understood. He wasn't unaware. He was involved. From that moment, everything I did was strategic. I documented every irregularity, saved emails, archived files, and mirrored server data onto a private drive encrypted under a harmless file name. And while everyone thought I was just another workaholic manager, I was quietly building insurance. So when the firm offered me a promotion to Director of Risk and Compliance, I negotiated the contract myself. Their lawyers sent over a standard template. I rewrote it. Buried deep under Section 14, post-termination rights, I inserted a custom clause. It granted me access to full disclosure and audit support in the event of an involuntary termination. In simpler terms, if they ever fired me, I had the legal right to request and review internal data tied to my department for 6 months after departure. It was a technical safeguard, hidden behind formal language and precedent citations. No one questioned it. Marcus even congratulated me for taking initiative. He had no idea he'd just signed his own trap. Years passed, and I played my role perfectly. I smiled, nodded, and pretended to admire his leadership. But inside, I was watching the house of cards grow taller, shakier. The firm's success was a mirage built on inflated valuations and buried liabilities. And Marcus? He grew bolder, convinced he was untouchable. Until the day I challenged him in that meeting. Until he called me insolent and threw me out like I was disposable. They thought they'd erased me. But I had the clause, the documents, and the proof. Now sitting in my apartment surrounded by files and silence, I began plotting my next move. I called my attorney, a quiet, brilliant man who'd helped me draft the original contract years ago. I told him everything. He didn't sound surprised. He just asked one question. Amelia, do you still have the clause copy? I opened my folder, pulled out the signed pages, and read aloud the line that would change everything. When I finished, he chuckled softly. Oh, they're in for a storm. Let's make sure the board hears this clause, word for word. The first step was silence. That's something Marcus never understood. Real power doesn't shout, it waits. While he celebrated my departure, I spent that week preparing. My lawyer, Daniel, drafted a formal request invoking the clause. It was concise, professional, and lethal. Under my contract, I demanded full access to audit data tied to my department, citing compliance continuity obligations. We both knew what it really meant. I was legally entitled to dig into their books. Marcus didn't see it coming. The board received the letter before he did. By the time it landed on his desk, the firm's legal counsel was already in panic mode. They'd signed it. It was binding. If they refused, it would constitute breach of contract, opening them to litigation. When Marcus called me, his voice was cold. What are you doing, Amelia? Exercising my rights, I said evenly. Surely a firm like Bellington respects contractual obligations. He hesitated. You're playing with fire. Then maybe you shouldn't have built your house out of paper. He hung up. The following Monday, I walked into Bellington's lobby again, not as an employee, but as a contractual auditor. Security hesitated, then let me through after reviewing the legal letter Daniel had faxed ahead. The expressions on my former colleagues' faces were worth every sleepless night. They whispered as I passed, some in sympathy, others in fear. But I wasn't there for them, I was there for the truth. For 3 days, I combed through data with surgical precision. Files, internal memos, transaction trails, nothing escaped my attention. I didn't have to search long. The evidence was everywhere, hiding in plain sight. Transfers masked as consulting fees, falsified client reports, and personal expenses buried under operational budgets. Marcus hadn't just bent the rules. He'd snapped them in half. On the third night, as I cross-referenced a string of offshore payments, I found the smoking gun, a transaction from an account under his wife's name, directly tied to the firm's shadow fund. It was enough to start a federal inquiry. Daniel was stunned. "This isn't just internal fraud," he said. "This is securities violation territory." That was when the real game began. We compiled everything into a sealed report and prepared to send it to the board's independent oversight committee, a group Marcus couldn't control. But before we could act, Marcus made his move. A courier arrived at my door with a thick envelope marked "Confidential." Inside was a legal notice, a cease and desist order, accusing me of data theft and breach of confidentiality. It was an intimidation play, meant to scare me into silence. I smiled. He was desperate. That night, I called Daniel again. "He wants a war," I said quietly. Daniel's tone was calm but firm. "Then we'll give him one, but on our terms." The next morning, Daniel sent a copy of our full audit findings, along with Marcus's threatening letter, to the board, flagged for urgent review. The storm had officially begun, and for the first time in years, Marcus Lane wasn't the one in control. I knew Marcus wouldn't go down quietly. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, on watching others bend beneath it. What I didn't expect was how quickly the people I once trusted would turn to protect him. 2 days after Daniel submitted our report, the board scheduled an emergency session. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. Rumors traveled faster than official memos. By mid-morning, the whispers had reached me. Marcus had painted me as a disgruntled ex-employee, a bitter woman seeking revenge after being terminated for misconduct. He'd spun a perfect story. According to him, I'd accessed confidential data without authorization, fabricated financial inconsistencies, and threatened to leak them to the press unless the firm paid me a settlement. It was a lie so absurd, I almost laughed, until I saw how many people believed it. Old colleagues stopped returning my messages. My professional network grew quiet. Even a friend from HR, someone I'd mentored for years, sent a curt text, "You should stop. It's not worth it." Marcus had done more than smear my reputation. He'd isolated me, and the silence that followed was the cruelest part. That evening, Daniel called. His voice was steady, but there was a strain behind it. "They're moving fast," he said. "Marcus convinced the board to open an internal investigation against you. He's accusing you of corporate espionage." I froze. "He's weaponizing their fear." "Exactly," Daniel said. "They'd rather believe you're the problem than face what you uncovered." He was right. The board wasn't just protecting Marcus. They were protecting themselves. They had benefited from his fabricated profits and inflated returns for years. Exposing him meant exposing them too. By the end of the week, I received a notice from the firm's legal department demanding I surrender all copies of internal data and sign a confidentiality reaffirmation. It was a trap. They wanted to silence me before I could act further. For the first time since this began, I felt a flicker of doubt. I'd spent years fighting for integrity, only to be painted as a criminal. My career was hanging by a thread, my credibility under attack, and the man responsible was still sipping whiskey in his corner office, untouched. But then something unexpected happened. Late one night, as I sorted through old email archives, I stumbled upon a chain I'd long forgotten. It was between Marcus and a senior board member. Subject line, Clause 14 revisions. The timestamp was from 3 years ago, during my contract negotiation. The emails discussed how they skimmed my revised terms and approved them blindly to expedite promotion. Attached to that thread was a draft with track changes. My clause, the one they'd overlooked, was highlighted. A comment beside it read, "Seems minor. Leave as is." Proof. Absolute proof that the board had ignored legal due diligence. I realized in that moment, Marcus hadn't acted alone. The very people sitting on that board, pretending to weigh fairness and ethics, had been complicit in negligence, and now they were trying to erase their own mistake by erasing me. I forwarded the emails to Daniel immediately. He was silent for a moment, then said, "Amelia, this changes everything." That night, as I stared out my apartment window overlooking the city skyline, I felt something shift inside me. The fear faded, replaced by something sharper, resolve. They thought they'd buried me under their lies, but they'd just handed me the shovel. If they wanted betrayal, I'd give them one they'd never forget, because now, I wasn't just fighting Marcus. I was coming for the entire board. I spent the next week building a chessboard while everyone else played checkers. Revenge, I decided, had to be procedural, clinical, inevitable, and public. Emotions made for messy trials. Contracts and precedent made for convictions. I would use their language against them. Law, audit, regulators, and shareholders. First, we sealed everything. Daniel and I created an indexed packet. Not a leak, not a threat, but an organized legal dossier. Transaction trails, email threads, the offshore flow, the board's leave as is comment about my clause, and the copy of my contract with the post-termination audit language front and center. Each file had metadata, timestamps, and cross-references. If they tried to claim fabrication, the timestamps would scream otherwise. Second, we deployed pressure points. I knew Marcus's true weakness, reputation and investors. He'd built his castle on glossy quarterly covers and confident conference calls. Strip away the confidence, and the castle revealed its cracks. We notified an independent forensic accounting firm under the pretext of compliance continuity, using my clause as authority. They were neutral, professional, uninterested in drama, and therefore credible. Their engagement letter made clear they'd be given unfettered access under my contractual right to audit post-termination. That word, unfettered, was my hammer. Third, we threaded the regulators. Daniel drafted a targeted referral to the securities oversight body, not as an explosive press release, but as a formal submission. Irregularities consistent with asset misstatement and potential misappropriation. We attached a redacted subset of evidence and the independent firm's preliminary engagement terms. Regulators move slowly, but they move with weight. Once they opened a file, the firm could no longer manage optics with spin. Fourth, we set the board on a timeline. Legal leverage is multiplied when the public market and investors sense uncertainty. We prepared a short factual letter to major institutional shareholders and the Independent Oversight Committee, offering them the full dossier under confidentiality. No headlines, just a choice. Review the evidence with us, or risk that the regulators' quiet investigation would become noisy if we had to defend ourselves in court. Institutional money hates risk. They would pressure the board for answers, and the board would have no choice but to act. Finally, I prepared for the human element. The flinch. Power freaks like Marcus tripled down when cornered. I expected threats, legal theatrics, and a PR blitz. So I rehearsed every scenario. Emergency subpoenas, injunctions, claim counterclaims. For every move they could make, Daniel had a legal response queued. The plan wasn't vengeance for blood. It was a dismantling of the ecosystem that enabled their cruelty. I wasn't after ruin for ruin's sake. I wanted accountability, restitution for investors, and the unraveling of a culture that rewarded impunity. We initiated the first visible strike quietly. The forensic team began its reconciliation under my contractual authority. Their first findings were prosaic and damning: misclassified expenses, circular transfers, and timing manipulations. They marked transactions for review that linked directly to accounts associated with the executive leadership. That's when the dominoes started to wobble. Investors asked for clarifications. The Independent Oversight Committee requested an emergency board meeting. Marcus called late into the night, voice taut with panic and venom. "You don't understand what you're doing," he warned. "You'll destroy a lot of people." I listened unflinching. "I understand what you did," I said. "That's why this matters." As the week unfolded, whispers became memos, memos became demands, and demands rippled into reputational risk. The firm's public valuation dipped. The press smelled a story, but we never rushed to the cameras. Daniel insisted on a surgical reveal, a board presentation with the forensic report, the email chains, my contract clause highlighted, and a formal request for the board to commission an independent external counsel review. It was procedural, humiliating, and impossible to ignore. On the morning we delivered the board packet, I felt neither triumph nor relief, only a focused calm. When Marcus finally stood before the independent committee and the forensic lead, the same men who once applauded him now had the evidence laid in clean, forensic language. He had no swagger left. He had only explanations. Revenge had to be smarter than rage. It had to be inevitable. And as they scanned the pages, the clause that had been their oversight, the clause they'd dismissed as minor, burned like a ledger of their own mistakes. They convened the room like a court. Glass conference table, bright lights, the city spread like a jury outside the windows. Marcus arrived with a practiced calm, but his hands betrayed him. The slight tremor when he reached for his water, the way he avoided eye contact with anyone not on his side. The independent counsel sat at the head of the table with the forensic lead beside him, papers in neat stacks like surgical instruments. I watched from the doorway, my folder heavier than it looked. The committee chair opened the meeting with legal phrasing and neutral tone, the kind of language meant to cushion damage while doing the hard thing. "We've received a formal submission alleging financial irregularities and possible misappropriation," she said. "We will review the forensic report and hear responses from executive leadership." Marcus rose first. He spoke in the same cadence that once commanded markets, polished, rehearsed, confident. He framed me as a vengeful ex-employee, accused me of unauthorized access, and accused Daniel of orchestrating a campaign to destabilize the firm. His words were precise. His aim was to muddy the water. Then the forensic lead stood. He didn't speak with drama. He spoke with evidence. He moved through the report like a conductor, pointing to reconciliations, flag transfers, and account mappings. He pulled up timestamps, cross-referenced emails, and walked them through the chain of custody. At each point, the room leaned in. The paper trail was not sophistry. It was a map. Every obfuscated payment led somewhere we could trace. Every consulting fee had names attached. The offshore account had a beneficiary. The beneficiary had links to Marcus's inner circle. When he reached the email thread where the board had dismissed my clause as minor, the room shifted. The counsel read the comment aloud and set the document on the table so everyone could see it. Marcus's smile hardened into something brittle. He began to talk faster, to interrupt, to call for context, but the lead kept the floor. The data was patient and precise. It didn't need charisma. Then Daniel did something Marcus hadn't expected. He asked the counsel to read the exact wording of my post-termination audit clause, the line that granted me access for continuity and review. He read it slow, letting every legal word land. The clause, once a whisper in a promotion packet, became a megaphone. It authorized the forensic engagement. It authorized our presence in the room. It effectively nullified Marcus's accusation that we'd acted outside authority. A board member who had avoided my calls all week cleared his throat and asked a quiet question. "If this is accurate, why were we not aware?" It was a loaded question. The forensic lead answered with dates and timestamps, with evidence of internal memos and approvals that had been overwritten or hidden. The implications unfolded like a map of rot. Marcus launched into defense. Blame shifting, alternate explanations, denial. He called some transactions errors of classification, and others legacy accounting adjustments. But every time he offered a narrative, the forensic report produced a document that contradicted it. When he suggested the offshore payments were authorized for legitimate advisory retainers, the lead produced contracts with forged signatures and inconsistent timestamps. When he accused me of fabricating files, the metadata traced the files to servers that had recorded changes long before my tenure. Sweat began to show along Marcus's collar. He made a last-ditch bid, threaten litigation, file for injunctions, accuse us of sabotage. It was a familiar move. When cornered, attack the messenger. But the independent counsel, who had no loyalty to Marcus, looked at the board with a clarity that cut through loyalty and politics. "We have a fiduciary duty," she said. "If these allegations hold, the board has failed its obligations to shareholders. We must act to preserve the firm." Silence fell like a curtain. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the chairwoman called a vote to suspend Marcus pending a full external investigation and to commission an independent legal review of board conduct. The motion carried by the narrowest margin. Some members voting for restraint, others against, one abstention. Marcus's face flushed with a color I had never seen on him. Pure, naked panic. He tried to argue, to beg, to brand me a saboteur, but the room had already begun to realign. Institutional investors had called. Their counsel had indicated they would support an independent review. The firm's stock, already wobbling, slipped further. The PR team had prepared a release that would be neutral but devastating. Leadership change pending inquiry. Marcus's executive privileges were frozen. His access to certain accounts was revoked. The board, which had once deferred to his charisma, now deferred to legal reality. As Marcus was let out, not by security, but by the gentle insistence of corporate procedure, he turned toward me. There was recognition there, not of malice, but of a man who finally saw the consequences of his miscalculation. "You'll pay for this," he said, voice low. Not a threat so much as a promise of future maneuvering. Outside, cameras had gathered. The story had leaked in the hours between the meeting and the vote. Reporters peppered the firm with calls, and the narrative churned. Scandal at Bellington, CEO suspended, whistleblower clause invoked. The press loved a neat arc, and we had given them one, but not the whole story. We would release facts when the legal architecture insulated us. Daniel and I exchanged a short look, the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had walked into a storm and emerged with the wind at their backs. But I knew this wasn't the end. The suspension was procedural. The legal battles were only beginning. Marcus would fight, countersue, and move with the kind of desperation that had been his hallmark. The regulators would dig, subpoenas would fly, and reputations hung in the balance. Still, I felt a strange, fierce relief. For the first time since they'd called me insolent, my voice had been heard where it mattered. The clause that had been dismissed as trivial had become the hinge on which the firm swung. They had underestimated a woman who read every footnote and trusted nothing but the paper trail. As the night closed, I walked out past the glass doors again, this time with journalists outside and the city watching. My phone buzzed with messages, some angry, some supportive, many opportunistic. I tucked the folder under my arm and kept my head high. There were still battles ahead, legal filings, investor meetings, and the slow, grinding work of accountability. But in that moment, with Marcus's shadow receding and the board scrambling to contain the fallout, I allowed myself one small private victory. They had called me insolent. The world had called me reckless, but in the clean, merciless light of audited facts, the truth had weight, and the truth had started to move. The next few weeks unfolded like a storm unraveling in slow motion. The regulators confirmed an official inquiry, and the forensic report was handed over to federal investigators. The board, desperate to salvage reputation, cooperated, pretending virtue after years of denial. Marcus vanished from public view, his smiling portrait quietly removed from the firm's homepage overnight. The markets reacted harshly. Shares plummeted, clients withdrew, and yet, amidst the chaos, a strange thing happened. The truth began to purify what was left. The firm issued a statement acknowledging structural failures in oversight, and publicly thanked the former compliance director whose clause ensured transparency. That single line was their way of admitting I'd been right. Daniel and I sat in the same cafe where I had once cried over my dismissal. This time there were no tears, only the quiet satisfaction of justice served without noise. The press was relentless, but I didn't chase interviews. I didn't need recognition. The documents spoke louder than any words I could say. Weeks later, I received a settlement offer, compensation for wrongful termination and damages. I signed not for the money, but for the final punctuation it placed on the ordeal. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted closure. When the last paper was filed, I visited the office one final time, not to gloat, not to remember, just to breathe the air of the place that once buried me. The glass doors still shimmered, the marble still gleamed, but the illusion had cracked. Power, I realized, isn't loud or cruel. It's quiet, precise, and written in ink that never fades. As I stepped back into the city, I smiled faintly. They fired me for insolence, but insolence, it turned out, was just courage misnamed. When I stood outside the building for the last time, the glass walls reflecting the dying light, I didn't feel victorious. I felt vindicated. They had called me insolent, difficult, unprofessional, but all I ever did was refuse to bow to hypocrisy. They thought they could silence me with shame, but truth doesn't bend that easily. In the end, I realized the real power never lies in obedience. It lies in understanding your worth and defending it, clause by clause, word by word. I didn't destroy them. I simply reminded them that arrogance has a cost, and silence has a limit. This is revenge untold, where betrayal meets justice, and silence writes its final clause. Don't forget to subscribe.